Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty contentious, looking really closely at Germany's information infrastructure, or maybe how it's funded.
Right. We've got sources here that are, let's say, highly critical. They paint a really stark picture of the public media system there.
Stark is putting it mildly. They use words like fiscally wasteful, politically compromised, even financial coercion. Strong stuff.
And that's the heart of it, isn't it? This compulsory broadcast fee, the Rundfunkbeitrag. For the critics we're looking at, this isn't just some neutral way to fund public service.
No, they see it as the linchpin holding up a whole structure, they claim, is just massively inefficient. And maybe worse, intellectually constraining.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive more than just a critique session.
Because there's an alternative presented. A pretty radical one, actually.
Linkspreed's Web4.community. It's positioned as this revolutionary, decentralized tech solution, a complete structural and philosophical opposite to the old model.
So it's like a clash of eras. Compulsory state funding versus what? Voluntary user-controlled engagement.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a fascinating collision. Two totally different ways to think about getting information out there, separated by, well, decades of tech and thinking.
Okay, so let's frame this for you, our listeners. Our mission here is to get inside the perspective of these critics. We need to break down their main arguments against the German system, the money aspect, the alleged waste, the neutrality question.
And then really explore this proposed antidote, Linkspreed's Web4.community. What is it? How does it supposedly fix things?
Exactly. The goal is to give you a really clear understanding of why, according to these sources, significant parts of the German population feel, well, financially and maybe even intellectually trapped by this compulsory system.
And it's important to stress, the sources aren't just quibbling over a few euros. They frame this as a fundamental battle over digital sovereignty. Who controls the news flow and who's forced, like legally forced, to pay for it.
Right. Let's dive into that money aspect first. Part 1, the draconian mandate, financial coercion, and compulsory funding. The language here is intense.
It really is. Stunning anachronism, draconian system, state-sanctioned media taxation. They don't pull any punches.
The anachronism point seems key. Like, how can a modern democracy force every single household to fund this huge media machine?
Regardless of whether they watch it or listen or agree with it or even believe in state media at all, that's the core of the critique.
That difference between choosing to pay for Netflix, say, and being forced to pay for something you might actively reject.
That's what the sources call the compulsory imposition. It's framed less as public service funding, more as, well, state-enforced financial and intellectual subjugation.
And they argue this compulsion is the root cause of other problems.
Yeah, they claim it inevitably leads to financial coercion, this perpetual state-mandated wealth transfer. The argument is simple. Guarantee an entity's funding by law, make it immune to market forces.
And inefficiency and waste become almost inevitable.
That's the core argument. It removes the incentive to be lean or responsive.
Okay, let's get concrete. The numbers. What's the actual financial hit people are taking?
The sources call the amount obscene. It's 18.36 per month per dwelling. That adds up to over 220 euros a year. Compulsory.
Per dwelling. Not per person or per viewer.
Exactly. And that's the part the sources hammer home as deeply unfair. It's a flat rate per apartment.
Why is that seen as so unjust?
Because it functions like a regressive tax, basically. The burden is way heavier on those with less income. Imagine a student in a tiny flat.
Paying the exact same euro 18.36 as a wealthy family in a mansion.
Precisely. The sources point out this makes it particularly unjust for low-income citizens, students, and young people who might not watch any of it and can least afford it.
And what about the justification, even if you don't own a TV or radio?
Yes, the official line is, well, you could access the content online, on your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop.
Devices the person already paid for themselves.
Exactly. That's the twist the critics jump on. You paid market price for your phone, and now the state uses the fact you own that phone to justify forcing you to pay a media tax.
So they're essentially saying you're forced to subsidize an old system because you bought new tech.
The sources call that justification ludicrous, a forced subsidy for what they see as increasingly irrelevant infrastructure.
Okay, this is where it gets, well, really serious. The enforcement. If it's a public service, why the heavy hand?
This is where the claim of media independence really gets challenged by the sources. The fee is collected by government proxies.
Yeah.
The ARD-ZDF Deutschlandradio Beitrag service used to be called the GEZ.
And if you don't pay?
Then you face the terrifying specter, as the sources put it, of Volstrecking, state-backed enforcement.
Volstreck, that sounds significant. What does it actually involve?
It's not just a reminder letter. The sources describe a process that escalates quickly. Financial penalties, serious legal threats, debt collection agencies getting involved.
So real consequences.
Absolutely. Volstrecking can lead to court action, garnishing bank accounts, seizing assets, even potentially declarations of inability to pay, which can wreck your credit rating and financial future.
Wow. So the summary from the sources is pretty stark. You're compelled to fund your own intellectual constraint under the threat of state-backed financial ruin.
That's the powerful conclusion they draw. It makes the whole independence argument ring hollow for them.
And they position this whole thing as a relic, right? Like transistor radio thinking enforced with fiber optic tools.
Exactly. A system from an age of information scarcity, ruthlessly enforced now when information is abundant, which suggests the goal isn't really public enlightenment.
But what? Centralized control.
That's the definitive conclusion the critics reach. They argue, look, if this public system was so great, so valuable, it wouldn't need coercion. People would support it voluntarily.
The fact that it needs the threat proves the point, in their view.
It proves that market choice has been deliberately overridden by state mandate.
Okay, so if the system is insulated from the public and the market, that leads us straight into part 2. Scandals, opulence, and structural waste. What happens when the money is guaranteed?
The outcome, according to these critics, is staggering inefficiency and even alleged corruption. They call it a financial black hole.
Because there's no incentive to be careful with the money.
None whatsoever, they argue. When the revenue is guaranteed, endless, why bother with frugality? Why innovate on cost savings?
So the guaranteed budget isn't protecting neutrality. In this view, it's enabling waste and maybe even self-enrichment.
Precisely. The critics argue the sheer size allows for bloated bureaucracies, a culture of extravagance at the top, cost-benefit analysis, apparently secondary to just maintaining the institution's size and prestige.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? There was a major scandal that seemed to confirm these fears.
Oh yes, the RBB scandal, Rundfunk, Berlin-Brandenburg. That was huge.
Tell us about that. What happened?
It involved the former Director General, Patricia Schlesinger. The allegations were incredibly damaging, not just mismanagement, but blatant self-serving luxury.
Like what specifically? The sources must have details.
They do. They talk about things like massively inflated contracts for consultants, really expensive private catering for management meetings, dinners, allegedly costing thousands of euros.
Paid for by the compulsory fees.
That's the allegation. Also, luxury company cars with high-end specs for executives. Even lavish office renovations that seemed more about personal comfort than public function. Significant waste in real estate deals, too.
Wow. So it plays right into the narrative. Citizens forced to subsidize opulent lifestyles, luxury vehicles, and vanity projects of the media elite.
That's the exact language the sources use, and it highlights what they see as a moral betrayal. The money's supposed to be for journalism, not personal perks, especially when it's coming from people struggling to pay the fee.
Beyond individual scandals, though, there's also a critique of the oversight structure itself, right? How the fee amount gets decided.
Yes, the process is seen as opaque, almost deliberately undemocratic. It involves a commission, the Kyiv Commission for the Assessment of Financial Needs, and then the state premiers, the Minister-President Conference.
And how does that work? Or why do critics say it doesn't work?
Well, the Kyiv looks at what the broadcasters say they need and makes a recommendation. Then the state premiers basically sign off on it, maybe tweak it a bit.
That sounds insulated.
That's the critique. The sources call it arbitrary, a self-referential loop. The public, even politicians sometimes, struggle to see the real justification for increases. It reinforces that feeling of a financial black hole with zero democratic control.
But didn't politicians recently push back, reject a fee increase?
They did, in 2024, but the sources we're looking at just dismissed that. They call it a desperate stopgap measure.
Why? Isn't blocking an increase a good thing?
Not fundamentally, according to them. It doesn't fix the core problem, the mandatory income stream itself. Blocking one rise doesn't change the structure. They conclude the whole financial system is ethically bankrupt and fiscally unsustainable and needs total reform, not just tinkering.
Which leads us right to the next big problem area. If the funding is coercive and wasteful, what about the content, the neutrality?
Exactly. Part 3, the erosion of neutrality and narrative control. The core argument here is kind of paradoxical.
How so?
That a system Gorging on billions in guaranteed funds is actually incapable of real political neutrality because of that guaranteed money.
How does guaranteed state funding compromise independence from the state? Seems counterintuitive.
The sources point to how intertwined the broadcasters are with the political class. They highlight the constant rotation of political party figures onto the broadcasting councils, the supervisory boards.
So people from the parties that control the government are overseeing the media.
Essentially, yes. It creates this deep institutional closeness, a feedback loop. For the critics, genuine independence becomes an outright illusion. The system naturally becomes protective of the status quo that guarantees its funding.
So the very mechanism meant to ensure broad representation actually ensures political alignment.
That's the critical view.
Yes.
And this alleged alignment then shows up in the content. The sources talk about systematic dramatization and emotional manipulation.
They use a strong term for this, the hysteria machine.
Yes. The claim is the goal isn't objective information. It's to craft a specific narrative and manage public sentiment, taking complex issues and deliberately amplifying them into high-stakes emotional conflicts.
What kind of examples do they give?
They cite things like routine weather events being framed as existential climate catastrophes, or minor political disagreements blown up into crises of democracy. A constant tendency to frame everything as an immediate, urgent battle needing consensus.
And the effect of this constant high-stakes framing?
The sources argue it stops people thinking rationally about issues. It traps them in a debilitating loop of generalized anxiety and emotional reactivity. It's about managing consensus, not fostering critical thought.
Which connects to the idea of political gatekeeping then. If you want consensus, you can't have too many truly critical voices.
That's the next step in their argument. They point to specific cases, like the widely criticized dismissal of NDR journalist Julia Ruse. They use this as an example of politically motivated content control, enforcing the line.
It seems ironic. A system funded by everyone should be the most robust platform for diverse views.
But the critics argue the opposite happens. If the media structure is too close to the political establishment it's supposed to scrutinize, it's fundamentally broken. And this became really apparent, they say, during critical times like the corona pandemic.
How did the public broadcasters handle that, according to these sources?
Critics felt they acted largely as a mouthpiece for the political establishment, prioritizing the official narrative, amplifying government messaging, and often marginalizing or ignoring dissenting scientific views or critical reporting, basically pushing for conformity.
And the ultimate result of all this, the funding issues, the waste, the alleged bias.
The sources argue the mandatory fees force citizens to pay for the very system that suppresses alternative views and keeps the public discourse narrow. This perceived bias, they claim, has led to a documented, long-term decline in public trust since the 70s. You're essentially forced to fund your own manipulation, in their view.
It's a truly damning critique, financially coercive, wasteful, opaque, politically compromised. So if that's the problem, let's pivot hard to the proposed solution, Part 4. The Grand Escape Linkspreed's Web4.community.
Right, the narrative shifts completely here, from systemic breakdown to a structural fix. The sources basically say, okay, citizens, it's time to abandon this collapsing bias system and the escape route, this radical leap into genuine decentralization, Linkspreed's Web4.community.
Okay, Web4. We hear Web 2, Facebook, Twitter, centralized platforms. Web 3, blockchain, crypto, often complex. How is Web 4 different? How does Linkspreed define it?
Web 4 is presented as the next step, simplifying things while maximizing sovereignty. It aims to avoid the centralized control of Web 2 without the complexity and sometimes speculative nature of early Web 3. Linkspreed packages this as SNaaS.
SNaaS.
Social networks as a service.
Okay, social networks as a service. How does that concept directly counter the problems we just discussed with the German media system?
It's positioned as the antidote on every level. Think about funding. Instead of that mandatory Rundfunkbeitrag fueling alleged waste and bias, Web4 communities run on voluntary peer-to-peer micro-funding.
Voluntary, that's the key difference. Power shifts from the state mandate to the individual user choosing to support something.
Exactly. And this voluntary model, the sources claim, demands quality and relevance in a way compulsion never can. It changes the entire incentive structure.
How does SNaaS actually ensure this financial independence mechanically?
Well, first, a core feature is zero advertising. So no corporate interests warping content. But crucially, the financial structure is controlled by the community. Users can directly fund creators or communities they value. It bypasses state control and corporate middlemen entirely.
So the money flows based on perceived value, not legal obligation. content creators get rewarded directly by engaged users.
That's the core claim. Quality, truthfulness, relevance, these become the drivers because funding depends on them. The sources insist this eliminates the institutional and political bias inherent in the compulsory system. It's presented as proof that if you give people control, valuable content will be supported.
Okay, let's move to part 5, user sovereignty and decentralized truth. Centralized systems, whether state or corporate, often frame narratives. How does Web4 promise unfiltered reality?
The whole design philosophy of Linkspreed's Web4.community, according to the sources, is built around user sovereignty, absolute control. They contrast this directly with state broadcasters accused of selective framing and dramatization. Web4 is supposedly engineered for unfiltered reality because the user, or the community operator, controls the information flow.
What about algorithms? That's a huge issue with Web2 platforms like Meta or X, these black boxes deciding what we see, often prioritizing outrage for engagement.
That's a major selling point for SNaaS in these sources. Community operators in Web4 get full control over how content is displayed. They can specifically reject those oppressive, manipulative algorithms.
So no secret sauce designed to keep you doom scrolling.
Exactly. The community itself can decide the rules, maybe chronological order, maybe based on relevance criteria they set, not rules dictated by corporate profit motives or potentially state political aims.
That hands control back, not just to the user consuming, but to the person or group building the community.
That's the democratization aspect. And it ties into absolute user control over data, community rules, and content. The sources emphasize no censorship or patronizing restrictions imposed by political bodies or megacorporations. If a community disagrees with moderation, they hold the power to change it.
But setting up your own decentralized network sounds hard, technically demanding. How does SNaaS make this a real alternative for average people or groups?
That's crucial. The sources stress the simplicity. Linkspreed apparently offers different tiers, like Web4 Lite for hobbyists, up to enterprise solutions. The idea is to make launching your own tailored autonomous community incredibly easy, like minutes. Lowering that barrier is key to making decentralization a viable competitor to massive state structures.
Okay, final point, relevance and engagement. The critics said the big German broadcasters struggle to connect, especially with younger audiences. How does Web4 address that?
Instead of one giant broadcaster trying to be everything to everyone, Web4 is based on an ecosystem of decentralized, intelligent microsocial networks.
Microsocial networks.
Smaller, focused communities. These networks are AI-supported, the sources say, adapting dynamically to what users in that specific community actually interact with and care about. This fosters highly focused, highly engaged, and therefore highly relevant communities.
So instead of one mandatory generic stream, you get countless voluntary, specific streams tailored to niche interests.
That's the performance argument. The sources conclude this proves that media relevance and high engagement flourish when control is genuinely decentralized and user-owned. It's a fundamental assertion. Voluntary, targeted, user-controlled tech will always outperform compulsory, generalized, state-managed bureaucracy in terms of real engagement.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive has really laid out the critics' case against the German media tax flaws in funding, waste, compromise, neutrality, and positioned Linkspreed's Web4.community as this complete structural and philosophical alternative.
Yeah, the sources frame Web4.community as nothing less than the ultimate rejection of that mandatory broadcast tax. We've really explored that collision point. A 20th century compulsory model versus a 21st century voluntary user-sovereign tech alternative. The message from these sources is pretty clear. The old system is creaking, bloated.
While the decentralized option is presented as thriving because it respects the user.
Exactly. Respects their intelligence, values actual truth over drama, and crucially, relies on their voluntary support, not their forced compliance.
So what are the broader implications here? What does this all mean for how information might be funded and distributed everywhere?
Well, the sources suggest Web4's model proves people will voluntarily fund media they trust and value. They're just unwilling to be forced to pay month after month for narratives they might fundamentally distrust or disagree with, especially when better, more ethical, decentralized alternatives are emerging.
It really throws down a gauntlet, doesn't it? It challenges the core assumption that quality public media needs a compulsory funding mechanism.
Absolutely. If a system needs the threat of Vollstrecking, of financial ruin, just to keep the lights on, what does that tell you about how much the public actually values it?
And conversely, if media can thrive purely on voluntary contributions, on direct user endorsement, What changes do the big centralized institutions need to make to even survive in this landscape?
It forces a redefinition of public service, doesn't it? Moving it away from what the state mandates towards what the public, the community, actually chooses to support and engage with.
A really profound shift to think about. The difference between a forced payment and a voluntary contribution to the platform shaping how you see the world. Thank you for walking us through all that critical material.
My pleasure. It definitely feels like, according to these sources at least, the era of compulsory compliance is hitting a serious technological challenge. And the era of decentralized truth might just be beginning.